Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is the first event of the new Justice Forum that we have put together at the Justice in Education Initiative at Columbia University at the Society of Fellows and Gay Men Center. We have a number of co-sponsors also. You will see them. We want to thank everyone for coming. I want to thank everyone for co-sponsoring this event. And I don't want to take much time at all from the discussion. I am Neni Panourgiá. I am the academic advisor at JAE, and I am also faculty at the prison education program at Columbia. And I will be in discussion with Dr. Ravi Shankar, but Ivan Calaff, our colleague, our esteemed colleague at JAE and the Center for Justice, who is the re-entry coordinator for the program, will moderate. So I am going to turn it over to Ivan, and then we will see how we're going to go down the boulders. Ivan.
Thank you. First of all, welcome everyone. Thanks to everyone for showing up. Thank you, Ravi, for agreeing to participate. So let me just introduce one of our guest speakers, right? Ravi Shankar. He's a Pushcart Prize-winning poet. He's also the author, translator, editor of 15 books, including most recently his memoir, Correctional, excerpts from which have appeared in the New York Times, the Marshall Project, the Daily Beast, NPR, and elsewhere. He teaches writing at Tufts University, is the outgoing chairman of the Asia Pacific Writers and Translator, APWT, and lives in Providence, Rhode Island. Guys, thanks again for everyone showing up. It's going to be an amazing conversation, and let's go to going. Back to Neni.
So, Ravi, thank you very much for being here. I just want to say for anyone who's just coming in that tonight we are discussing Ravi Shankar's Correctional, an autoethnography, a magnificent book, which is most poetic in its writing, and although it is not what we would normally call poetry, it is poetic prose. It is written in a manner that is incredibly accessible, humane. It is something that we don't really see very often in autobiographical writing, because it actually draws the reader in, not only on the level of the individual person, but also in explaining questions and asking questions that are larger in ways that transcend the personal and become intersubjective. So I would like to get started by quoting initially from towards the end, the epilogue of the book. Ravi is having a conversation with a person who is staying with him in Hartford, Connecticut, and Ravi will go there. His name is Chaos, and Chaos says to Ravi, "Promise me you'll tell our stories." And Ravi writes on page 218, "There are many sides to each story, many stories to each side." Ravi, I would like to invite you to get spooling the story from the epilogue of the book and take it any which way you want it to go.
Well, thank you so much, Neni, and I want to thank the Sophia Haman Center and School of the Arts. This is a real thrill for me because, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, but I got my graduate degree at Columbia at the School of the Arts over 20 years ago. And so it's really nice to to be back at Columbia with this memoir. And as Neni mentioned, there are a number of strands to this story. I'm really pleased. I think somewhere in the audience, my mother's here, and it does tell my family's immigration story from South India. There are some pictures and narratives of my grandfather, who was a journalist for The Hindu, the largest English language newspaper in India. And my upbringing as a bicultural Indian American, growing up in Northern Virginia and then moving back to India to take care of my grandmother at a very young age. And so that's one of the strands in this story. But the core of the story, and I think what we will spend a lot of time discussing today, were these unexpected encounters I had with the criminal justice system in the middle of a really successful life. After finishing graduate school at Columbia, I got a job at a university in Connecticut, a state university. I got tenure. Really, in many ways, except for the very heavy teaching load, it was my dream job. I was teaching poetry, which is what I love and what many of the other books that I've mentioned are published in. And it begins when I go back to New York, almost a decade after I lived there. And I lived in New York in the late 90s through 9/11. And then I moved to Connecticut, which is only 2 hours away. Some people say it might be a universe away, though it is really so close, and yet it's so radically different in so many ways. And so I was living in a small homogeneous town in Connecticut. And this very first encounter that I describe was when I was back in the city at a literary event and driving home with my cousin when I got caught in this Mayor Bloomberg stop and frisk. And in fact, it was for an erroneous warrant. It was for a 5'6" white guy, weighs about 150 pounds. As you can clearly see, I'm not standing, but I'm about 6'2", and hopefully, if I'm doing good and dieting, under 200, maybe. Let's hope. So it was a clear case of a mistaken identity, but it was more than that, because I was racially slurred. I was kept for 72 hours at Central Booking, which is this large, and as I wrote this book, I realized that this is this shadow America that exists, that is always around us, that we go through our lives perhaps avoiding the fact of, and this is certainly one of the cases, that under the streets of Wall Street in downtown Manhattan, you have this a large urban facility housing prisoners. And I can stop there, Neni. I mean, I can read a little bit from there as well, but
I actually don't want you to stop, because the way that you're actually relating this is the way, pretty much the way in which you have written it. And I'm hearing you saying these words, and it's as if I am reading the words on the printed page. I just let me just add one more piece of this puzzle here, of not of the puzzle of the events, but of the puzzle of who you are, right? Which hopefully will lead us to explanation, or some way of finding some way of working through the events, but also it will give us a better sense of how it is that anyone, literally anyone, not literally anyone who is not tall, white, male, blue-eyed, Upper East Side resident, probably, anyone can fall into this rabbit hole of the social injustice system that exists in this country. So you say I just want to go a little bit, I'm still staying with the epilogue because I think that most of us know that epilogues are the first parts of books ever to be written, as introductions are usually the last parts of a book to be ever written. So I think that the epilogue just gives what you're trying to do in the book. I mean, all the scaffolding of the book is there. So you say in the epilogue that without Hartford Correctional, and I'm quoting here, I might have gone through my days blithely unconcerned about the plight of prisoners and the undeniable institutional racism of mass incarceration. But I'm thinking back many pages before that, when you were first at Connecticut Correctional, where someone says to you that, or you realize that your people, right, are not part of the Black and Latino struggle, right? So I would like us to talk a little bit, to think a little bit about these, because we talk about Black and brown people nowadays. We talk about the struggle. We include in Black and brown people a lot of people who are, that have different pigmentation. But what does it mean when we actually say, when we talk about the Black and brown people on one hand, and then on the other hand we say, you might be, who was it who said to you, you might be colored, but you're in Black? Mm-hmm. What, right? What does that mean? How can we take these things apart, like the just unspool this scheme of different stories, as you say, and different identities that you are carrying and you're thinking through. And then maybe Ivan would like to jump in here also. Who's darker than I am, but still.
I think maybe this is part of what makes correctional unique, is that it is told from the perspective of someone who's benefited from enormous privilege all my life. I mean, Indian Americans, if you look at per capita income, are the wealthiest group, even wealthier than white Americans. And my father came over to study engineering. He actually went to school at Howard in DC, which is where I was born. Growing up, I used to think it was Harvard, but he was actually in Howard in the late 1960s, right at the height of the civil rights movement. He was there when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and they sent in the National Guard, and there were the riots in DC. And I often, in thinking of your question, I try to put myself back into his eyes, because of course he was one of the first waves. We had these highly restrictive immigration policies in place that forbade people from countries that were deemed undesirable from coming in. And my father was part of that first wave of Asian immigrants allowed to come. And he had, I'm sure, these visions of grandeur. And then to arrive in DC at Howard in the midst of the civil rights movement, he was living on his uncle's couch. And I wonder about that schism between what he expected and what he found. And so, my own experience, certainly growing up in Northern Virginia, my parents still live in Manassas, known for the Battle of Bull Run and Lorena Bobbitt, not the most cosmopolitan place on earth. And I was, probably the only South Asian family around. In my elementary school, I certainly stood out and experienced a different kind of racism, not history, not generations worth. And yet I found that I would be teased for my sense of difference. I think about the way in which I was raised, and we can kind of talk about this, but I was, my parents are Tamilian Brahmin. There is this idea of kind of Brahmin exceptionalism. Some of you are familiar with the caste system. Isabel Wilkerson's, of course, written a great book where she kind of calls race is the skin and caste is the bones, right? It's what keeps everything in place in a certain way. And so, Brahmins were meant to be, vegetarian and teetotalers, were devout, scholarly, and there was a little sense of superiority. And yet, by virtue of my skin color and my ethnicity, I was also discriminated against from a very young age. And so, and I think that really amplified in some ways after 9/11. That there was a way in which, as an Indian American, I was being lumped together by many with Islamic terrorists. And, there isn't a lot of nuance, unfortunately. And one of the people that you talk about tells me when I was caught up in the stop and frisk, and I was shocked. I'm a professor in Connecticut. I'm driving back home and to be stopped and put into jail for erroneous warrant was something that I could not even really conceive of. And yet when I talked to the men that I met, who were primarily, and again, this is when I talk about institutional racism, we can know a lot of these facts theoretically, but experiencing it firsthand, it's what I can't unsee what I've seen. And most of the men around me were men of color, whether they were Latino or African American or Haitian. And when I started, they all wanted to know. I was just in a big cell with many of these men, all waiting for their court date. It was over the weekend, so you have to wait for the judge to be able to see you to let you bond out. And everyone wanted to know what you're in there for. And when I kind of explained with some amazement and shock, they laughed and they said, "Oh, you got caught in a stop and frisk. It doesn't matter if your skin is darker than a grocery bag. You're at risk if you're in the streets of Manhattan," and which I thought of, I still do, as the kind of cosmopolitan center of the world, a really international, global place. And yet, and much of what I would hear in there would become kind of substantiated when stop and frisk was later found to be unconstitutional, and whistleblower testimony in fact proved some of the things that I was being told in there. There was a competition between precincts for collars, that there was a way, and I think under stop and frisk, nearly 800,000 innocent New Yorkers were stopped under the rhetoric of public safety. And so, I mean, and I can only speak from my own experience, but to kind of be presumed to be criminal a priori before you've done anything, how does that alter your relationship to authority, to your community, to yourself? I found that it made me much more paranoid, kind of hypervigilant, more reckless. But all of this was kind of happening on a subconscious level. And what I realized is this brief brush gave me just some glimpse of what it is like to be African American in this country. And of course, and when I was in Hartford Correctional, I had much more privilege, much more access to resources, a much broader support network, a highly paid attorney than many of the men around me. And so there was this kind of difference. And yet there was also this sense that we shared something by virtue of our difference from dominant society in some way. And so that was a point of kinship. But I know exactly what you mean. I have a friend who really doesn't like that term POC, people of color, because he feels that it kind of lumps together a Singaporean banker with someone who whose parents were incarcerated and grew up really disadvantaged. And but I think what I like about it is there's a way that you can have a kind of an alliance and a collective sensibility that you're speaking up towards and against a dominant culture. And so I guess that is the way. It's like I feel like I can empathize deeply, even if I'm not African American, from my experiences.
Yes. So really quickly, I read the book, and the book is amazing. So I got a question. What was your relationship? I got two questions. I have two questions. what was your relationship or your experience with law enforcement of the criminal legal system prior to your incarceration as compared to what it was afterwards? And my second question is, how much is, through your research writing this book, and in your opinion, how much is the mass incarceration, how much is it due to the social inevitabilities that you spoke about, as opposed to personal choices that people make?
Great questions, Ivan. I'll take the first one first. I mean, I think my parents never had to have really the conversation with me. I think they didn't really understand how policing or anything really works. And yet, growing up, I certainly had been stopped and pulled over, occasionally kind of harassed by police officers, but I'd never been in any kind of overt trouble with the law. After this wrongful arrest, and we were just talking about this before we went on, but it was almost in Sanskrit. There's this phrase of kind of a drishti, a dark cloud that can overtake your life. And that's what it felt like for a couple of years there. And certainly I was culpable. I made some really poor decisions and a concatenation of bad luck. I ended up having these other encounters. And I found, I mean, once you're in the system, it is really hard to get out. It is a Venus flytrap, it wants to kind of keep you in. I ended up eventually getting a DUI, and I drove on a suspended license very stupidly and ended up having to do these 90 days at Hartford Correctional. And all of that happened, pretty late in my life. And so I think that was perhaps part of the surprise of it. When I finished all of this, in the process of writing this book, I did get my doctorate at the University of Sydney, looking exactly at this question of how did mass incarceration begin, and when and how did it become so racialized? And I think part of what is so difficult to change in our legal institutions is that they're so deeply and historically embedded. It's like trying to turn a glacier or the Titanic. Because there are all of these roots that go back. And I found, the puritanical colonialists who came over here brought with them initially what were called the bloody codes in England. They believed in the sanguinary punishments, which were public punishments, right? Beatings and whippings and brandings, the scarlet letter. There was a way in which criminals were meant to be publicly humiliated and shamed so that there would be an example for people to conform. And interestingly, it was the Unitarians and the Quakers of the time who were, kind of a little bit more liberal, and who thought that this is a really brutal form of practice. And why don't we have these jails, gulls as they were called, which usually were only used to kind of hold in prisoners on their way to trial or something temporary. Why don't we use this as actually the kind of punishment? And the Quakers believed in rehabilitation, and what they believed in is that through the implementation of, they called it the congregate prison system, labor and silence were the two things that they felt like could help redeem someone. And so you would work side by side, not allowed to talk to anyone, and then you weren't allowed to speak at night. And the UN has shown that, and we find the roots today in privatized prison and prison labor, and in solitary confinement in the SEG. And so from the very beginning, having your voice taken away, there is a way in which there's this dehumanization that happens. And I think that thread has continued, because though it might have been more humane to have imprisonment, my argument is that the puritanical zeal for shaming never left. In fact, it became a little bit easier, because now out of sight, out of mind. Now, we often forget that prisons don't just keep people in, they keep the public out. So now things can happen. And it was my experience at Hartford Correctional that much of the focus was not on rehabilitation, but it was on more punishment, re-stigmatizing, dysregulating these men, and under the guise of, we're keeping people safe. And so and I talked to so many people, and you know, when 1 year on the inside, I kind of write this, that I felt like my bullshit meter had been busted because I couldn't really tell. People were, you know, people say, you know, they tell you all kinds of stories. But I did talk to a lot of people who, you know, someone who was smoking a joint on the street who got arrested and had a cash bond that I didn't think was too much, but that he couldn't meet. And his case was being continued, and he'd been waiting in jail for 6 months, at which time he lost his job. His first child had been born. He'd missed the birth of his child. And now he had this criminal record, and he didn't know how he was going to go forward in the world. So I heard a lot of different stories like that. And it seems like certainly things that are criminalized in one part of our country are not. And you can see this state by state, but you can even within communities that are adjacent to each other, very different kinds of policing, very different kinds of sentencing. And these are all facts that you can look up. You know, when people talk about prisons, I always like to quote facts, because this is why it's not Republican, it's not Democratic, but it is a human issue. And that's why someone like, you know, Michelle Alexander in The New Jim Crow beautifully elucidates it. But, you know, according to statistics from the Bureau of Prison Statistics, a Black man born in 2001 has a 1 in 3 chance of being incarcerated, right? If you think about that, that's mind-boggling. It is, and I think the other thing to think about, and the thing that blew my mind, is that how relatively modern a phenomenon this is, that it is really in the last 40 years or so that we've seen this enormous explosion. And so that was the other thing that when I was doing this research, I found that, you know, the two great moments of growth of the prison population, one happened after the Civil War in the post-Reconstructionist South, where, as many of we know, the 13th Amendment, the very amendment abolishing slavery, has this little coda, unless, then under a whole host of trumped up laws, from apprenticeship laws, vagrancy laws, you know, if you were practicing a trade, you needed to have a white tradesperson sign off on your ability to do it. And otherwise you could be arrested and fined. And if you couldn't pay it off, then you were then imprisoned and forced into labor sometimes. States had convict leasing systems where you would be brought to other states to do all the undesirable jobs that no one wanted to do, to dig the ditches and work on the railroads. And then at the end of the 1970s, right at the end of the civil rights movement, again, the war on drugs. We have, you know, this kind of people, nonviolent offenders, people who may have mental health issues or substance abuse problems, now being incarcerated more and more. And when you overlay with the demographic of who are the people being incarcerated, it is so racially skewed that it's the kind of thing that I feel like, when I find out more and more about, that should have us protesting in the streets, because it's totally antithetical to the very idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, the very fundamental notion of an equitable democracy. You just have to look at the criminal justice system, and you.
With that said, is this a book about abolition? Is that what this book is also about?
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, I think it is. It's my testimony, and it is my hope that it's not just a mere literary artifact, but it opens people's eyes and helps them get involved in some way. I mean, can our prison system be redeemed? I think are so many ways in which it is kind of irretrievably broken. But I did look at when I was doing this graduate work at, you know, because the other thing to think about is the rates of recidivism in the US are higher than in almost any other developed nation. So it feels to me like there is actually a kind of investment in failure that is taking place. Because if you look at other countries, and what the example that often comes to mind is Norway, the Scandinavian prisons that have some of the lowest recidivism rates. And they they treat the prisoners more humanely. You have access to kind of an apartment, you can cook, you can learn a trade. There are counselors there. Education, right? Education, having access to arts, to therapy, all of these things we know for a fact help people to reintegrate and to own their own stories and to heal themselves. And yet, what we've seen in the US is that in many places, and this was true at Hartford Correctional, any of the writing programs and arts programs that had existed in the 70s had been taken out. The prison library had been totally stripped away because they said, oh, well, it's making the people research their cases and like clogging up the system. And yet these are all the things that we know can help. So, you know, if you were to ask me on that spectrum, yeah, I probably am towards the abolition end of things, I would say.
Well, you at some point, I mean, this really follows up this question that Ivan posited, going just a little bit back and thinking about rehabilitation and reintegration, right? And Ivan, obviously, he is the reentry coordinator for the program, and I teach in the prison system, right? I mean, investing in educational projects that would actually help people rehabilitate. That's the discourse, right? That's the discourse of the state. Also, that's the discourse of, as you say, of Western of capitalism of Western society. So when I'm thinking, listening to you is and reading about this double objective of rehabilitation and reintegration, what comes to mind, and the question that was raised in me, was if we are actually talking about reintegrating people into society, I wonder if people who have been put away by a social justice system or social injustice system from the age of 8, 10, or 11, right, have ever been integrated into society to begin with, right? I mean, has society ever made any efforts to integrate into it people who will, as you say, eventually go in and out from very young age? So that's what I would like us to talk about, if you won't mind.
Yeah, I think that this is the other part of the equation that we don't really think about, is that this mass incarceration has rippling generational effect, right? And so a lot of the people that I met had parents who had been incarcerated. And so all of a sudden you're being raised by a single parent or by someone who's not your guardian, and the kind of economic devastation, the lack of stability, all of those things. And then when you're on the inside, I mean, rather than being a conducive environment in any way, I mean, there's a sociologist, Craig Heaney, who talks about the different symptoms that result from being institutionalized, right? You get dependent on institutional structures, you have interpersonal distress, suspicion, alienation, psychological distancing. You withdraw socially, you get isolated. There's certain exploitative norms of prison culture that you start to internalize, get a diminished sense of self-worth. And then, you know, you're debilitated by shame. And instead of there being any mechanism to kind of address these things, because these are the very things that will prevent people from successfully reintegrating, my experience at Hartford Correctional was that these traumas were being reinscribed. That there were I'm a college professor, and then one of the first things I did was to volunteer my time at the school. I said I would, and all of my requests were ignored. I found most of the time, you're just waiting. People are just, telling stories and shit talking and playing cards and chess. And yet there was a hunger for any school, any kind of educational opportunity. And yet all of these things were being kept. And it almost felt to me kind of this casual sadism, and almost an intentional way to say, oh, well, you messed up. And so not only are we going to take you away from society and from your family, when you're here, we're going to re-traumatize you and re-humiliate you and beat you up even more, which seems to me just counterproductive. The very essence of a formula that doesn't work, because many of these men and women will go back into society. And as the rates, I think that the Vera Institute found that 78% of the incarcerated will be reincarcerated within 5 years, right? Compared to a percentage in Norway that's less than 20%. And yet the amount of money that is being thrown into this, and this is why I think that I hope my book opens people's eyes, because many states have been spending 3 times as much on incarceration as education. Here where I am in Rhode Island, the average cost to incarcerate someone is about $65,000 a year, of which less than 10% goes to health care or to mental health. 75% of that goes to security, right? To the administration, and so one wonders, if you take this money, I mean, if you look at California, California spends even more to incarcerate. I think that it's such a skew. It's like $100,000 to incarcerate someone, and they spend about $11,000 per individual on educating them. And so what does that say about our society when the equilibrium is so off base? And what if those funds, and this is why I think we should all be interested in this issue, because it's our taxpayer money that's going to fund these systems. What if this money went into community programming and into counseling and into job opportunities and reentry programs? I mean, a lot of these reentry programs too depend on governmental grants that are, especially during the pandemic. You could probably speak to this, Ivan, but it's a kind of shoestring budget. And not only that, I've been helping some men and women with their resumes, and I hear these stories. And one guy who worked with Donnell was telling me that before I was incarcerated, I was studying accounting. I'm a musician, I'm a father. I have all these sides. Now that I've come out, and I'm really thankful that reentry exists and these programs exist, but they're telling me that the only thing I can do is work retail or flip burgers. Maybe if I'm really lucky, get a trade somewhere. But I was a much more complete human being before this experience, and now I am being reduced. And this is happening on a kind of a local level as well as a national level. I mean, in many states, if you're a felon, you're disenfranchised, right? You lose your right to vote in some cases, and certainly your right to move around freely. I think probation and parole have been more about surveillance than actually helping people to re-enter. And so that's what I found. There's a big gulf between the rhetoric and the reality. There's a lot of talk about rehabilitation, but in fact, my experience was that it is actually the opposite, that all the forces are conspiring to dysregulate these men and women and make it harder for them to survive on their own and maybe more institutionally dependent.
But that goes back to what you were saying earlier, Ravi, about the punitive component of the system, right, in the United States. And what you write somewhere in the middle of the book, where you say, which is something that we see every day with our scholars and the people that we work with, and this is a quote, you say, even though we might have truly repented and changed, we will never quite be forgotten, forgiven in American society, right? So that's the essence of this entire conundrum that surrounds rehabilitation and reintegration, right? The fact that in essence, American society just never forgives.
And this is what I kind of trace all the way back to the Puritans, right? I mean, there was a way in which, someone like Hester Prynne, if you're guilty of something, you can atone for it and rehabilitate and reintegrate. But shame means it's not that you committed a crime, it is that you in fact are a criminal. And this is something that you will wear for the rest of your life. And certainly this is the case if you have a criminal record. I've experienced it. I only have a misdemeanor conviction, and I've experienced difficulty. And I've talked to so many people who, even though we have this notion of intentional inclusion, it so rarely happens in the workplace. It's really easy when you're doing the first call, to say, oh, well, this person has a conviction. Of course, we don't want to have that person, without thinking that, in fact, I mean, in some cases, I feel personally that I'm much more empathetic. I think I'm a better educator and a better communicator for having gone through these experiences. And what you're doing when you're shutting the door in the faces of so many deserving men and women is you're both resentencing them, but also kind of jeopardizing yourself, because you're not allowing for them to contribute productively to society. And so many of the men that I met, so ingenious. I mean, they were able to, and I describe in the book how they could build stingers and convention ovens out of little pieces of wire they found in the canteen, and how, the art that they were making, and some of the writing. I mean, I met a couple of people who I told very seriously, you're writing poems on a level that is, comparable to my graduate students. And it broke my heart to know that they would just be in the pages of this notebook and nothing would ever happen. And that, I think, is why when these men, they shared these stories, their hopes, dreams, and intimate stories with me. And I did make them a promise, because they knew, and they said, you have a voice on the outside, but no one listens to us and no one cares about us. And even if we want to speak our story, no one wants to hear it. Right. And so I said, you share this with me, and I want to do something with it. But yes, I think that there needs to be kind of a fundamental shift in some way, that moving beyond the model of punishment, because it's ultimately the model of compassion is really much more productive for everyone involved. And it seems to me, but I mean, it is so deeply embedded in the American psyche, I guess is my point, that it's really hard to extirpate it, because it is just like hammered into us. And certainly it is riveted into the very institutional foundations of our legal system, criminal justice system, et cetera, which makes it so hard to uproot, I think.
Well, you bring this up in a very interesting, and you make a very interesting connection between this level of what do you call reflexive racism and toxic masculinity, right? And he has a fantastic phrase in Autumn Collett, right? Where he said, "Dear brothers, male intimacy is a timorous creature." So I just want to invite you to talk a little bit more here about this, the connection, this complicity that you are drawing as a scheme between masculinity, or what we call toxic masculinity right now, because all masculinity hopefully is not toxic, and this ubiquitous reflexive racism, right? I mean, how do you see them informing each other? How do you see the two working in tandem? I mean, obviously, you see that you in the book you go through this in a number of pages. It's not intuitive. You have a way of approaching this this connectivity between the two. But I would like to see if you would say something about it.
Yeah, I think that it is really deeply intersectional. I think we have a lot of trouble talking about race, and we have a lot of trouble kind of talking about gender. And they're two of the largest areas of inequity that exist in this country. And, you know, I found that in terms of this toxic masculinity that there has been in the men I met, certainly in my own life, I know a kind of a repression of emotion and a kind of interdiction against making oneself vulnerable, showing weakness, that there was a way in which to be masculine, you needed to kind of have conquests, and you needed to show off your material acquisitions, and all of these things, I think, don't help. And I think it is a kind of attitude that could allow you perhaps to consider someone to be your personal property. As I mean, when slavery existed as an institution for over a quarter of a millennia, right? I mean, so how could that really pernicious idea take root? And there's something in that that is related, I think, to this idea of the masculine, of someone who's the master of his domain. And I also, though, found when I was out at Hartford Correctional, interesting ways in which my easy stereotypes of masculinity were ruptured, because I saw some of the, you know, toughest, hardest guys that I've ever seen, with some who had scars and tattoos, and they would be braiding each other's hair, and they'd be cooking mofongo together on the prison bench, and they would be creating a kind of a family, you know, in spite of all of the pressure that existed to kind of tear them apart. In spite of that, there was this kind of a brotherhood in there, which I found really kind of touching and really unexpected and interesting in some way. I mean, I feel like there were some ways in which some of the men were able to let their guard down in there in a way that in the outer world they wouldn't. They kind of showed things and said things that I feel, and I don't know, because unfortunately I haven't been able to keep in touch with many of these men, but it felt to me like in some ways there was occasionally a bit of a safe space. But, you know, of course, at the same token, there's always this kind of projecting certain kind of toughness or a certain kind of image, which comes from fear. You know, I always think about the fact that hatred is the underside of fear. It's really the things that we're afraid of that we tend to kind of demonize. Yeah, I think there isn't a really healthy, productive dialogue for or a way in which young boys are taught to talk about their feelings, and I think that is really too bad. I mean, that's my job as a poet, I guess, is to talk about some of this.
Yeah. Some of this is, I mean, you talk about a lot of tensions in the book, and a lot of the tensions that exist within you. So just talking about you as a masculine being is one of those tensions. But you also mention other tensions. You produce these other binaries, and one of them actually struck me. At some point, you say that, you know, who am I, right? I'm a professor and a prisoner, a thief and a saint, a citizen and an anarchist, and that's where I want to. That's where I want to, I mean, not necessarily press you, but at least ask you if really being a citizen and an anarchist is a tension.
Yes, it seems an oxymoron. And yet I think, I talk about, I mean, in the epilogue of the book, or right before that, I talk about this Australian figure of the larrikin, which is this kind of a masculinist figure, but someone who is kind of a prankster, or someone who tries to finagle his way around the rules and the laws, because a lot of times they don't make sense and they're pretty biased, and you can see that. And so you're trying to work your way around that. And I think that there is a way, perhaps that's also rooted to my Indian identity. I mean, I think if you live in a country of over 1 billion people, you kind of have to do what you can to survive. And so, of course, that isn't relevant to me here, but I think some vestige of that probably remained in my behavior in some way. Yes, I think that you can, to be a citizen and an anarchist, how can you hold both of those things? And I think in so much as what is most important are the relationships that we have with one another, rather than the institutions that exist to kind of to support us, but oftentimes to corral us and constrain us. And that you can be kind of anarchist in terms of not subscribing to some of these dogmas and laws, and yet be a citizen and still be really deeply interested in creating community with other people. So I don't know if that is an evasive answer or not. I have to think about that more, but yes.
I think it's a totally evasive answer, but I know that there are other people who will pick up on that, and you won't be able to just evade as easily about being a citizen and being an anarchist. To me, there is no tension there. But you know, it's good to hear you say that. I have one last thing, which of course I hope some of the people here will actually find light. So there's a chapter in the book that's called Nomenclature, and it's about your name, right? So Ravi Shankar, who every time I've said to anyone, right? Yes, where we have invited Ravi Shankar to talk about his, and I don't even get to his book. People say, and they say, no, not that one. That one is dead. We have another Ravi Shankar. So, and I of course am thinking about someone who is still inside, who also has a very famous name that he shares with a very famous, also dead musician. And I wanted to ask, can I say his name? Okay, so his name is John Lennon. John, actually, you know who John Lennon is, right? I mean, he writes in the Marshall Project. He writes in Esquire. I mean, he is very much involved in advocating for prisoners' rights and just exposing the insides of prison life to the outside. So what I'm trying to ask here is this: you have a number of names that people were calling you, and I will read them. So Abu Dhabi, India, Apu, Kumar, Bin Laden, 7-Eleven, terrorist, and professor, right? and all these are being thrown at you as you're actually trying, from what I understand, and speaking with John Lennon also, from what I understand, on a certain level, when you are inside, you try to, you're trying to create and hold on to your being as who you are, but also to go on a certain level unnoticed, right? So, of course, you are Ravi Shankar, of course, you're John Lennon, of course, you don't want your professor to walk into the classroom every time that she sees you, say, So John Lennon or Ravi Shankar, right? So how does it work? I mean, what does it do to your presence in the room?
Yeah, and I think I've always talked about this as my great curse and blessing in a way, because from a very young age, and now I get it less. But when I was growing up, he was still, it was like, you taught the Beatles how to play the sitar. You're at Woodstock, or oh, Nora Jones is your daughter. And the other thing is, anytime anyone ever would say that, they would think they were being totally fresh and original every single time. And it's like, oh, I've never heard that one before. Thanks. Yeah. But I kind of relate that to the fact, and my mother's here, so she could maybe speak to this. My parents weren't even music fans. I mean, the naming convention in India is such that I was born in January, which in South India is Pongal, the festival of harvest, and Ravi in Sanskrit means sun. And so that's kind of why I had this name. They weren't, but it made me impervious in a way when I was on the inside and I was being called all of these different nicknames, which I will say, first of all, that when you get a nickname, that is when you're accepted in there, right? I mean, everyone kind of was known by a nickname. And I talk about some of the people I met, Smurf and Tattoo and, Chaos, all of the Junkie John. They all have been kind of given these names, and and you are almost enacting a kind of a caricature of yourself, which is a certain defense mechanism, I think. It took me a while. I mean, when I was first in there, I was terrified. I mean, I was a professor, what was I going to find? And I did, as you said, wanted to disappear into the wall. And then I realized, because I had to do that initial stint, we could talk about this also, that these 90 days were stretched out over about a year and a half, which in retrospect, I mean, it was because I had a paid attorney, and so I was able to get out to teach and all the rest of it. But every time you have to get reprocessed, it is traumatizing, humiliating. It spreads your ass cheeks. You get your prison tans, and you're put into a population with men that you don't know. And so, I talk about how I thought I had it figured out, and I go back in, and it's like, no, you don't. When I started to kind of get to know these men a little bit more, and that's I talk about as the real silver lining in this book, is because they were probably people I wouldn't have encountered in my everyday life, and yet their stories were really so meaningful to me. And I was called by these kind of racist nicknames, but it was hard to, but they were said affectionately, which sounds like hard to imagine. But when I was called these things, it was almost like I was part of the guys, and that's it. I wasn't being called that to be insulted, which sounds really kind of strange. And I think my experience having had this more famous name, I talk about in that chapter some of the good things that have happened to me, some of the bad things, has made me. In fact, I think there's also Sri Ravi Shankar, this yogi of the art of living. So I think I might actually be the third most famous Ravi Shankar on earth. But so it made me realize that, there's a certain distance from who we're called or identities or what we're referred to, that in fact, we are something different, and we're kind of irreducibly human before we are all of these labels that we attach to ourselves in some way.
You do say that all these words, right, are words. The names that you're being called are just words. They're being thrown at you completely, you say, unironically, which is a fantastic way of actually saying what you just said, that there was no big deal. There was a gesture, an affectionate gesture on a certain level. I can't help but think about also the connection between John Lennon and Ravi Shankar, right? In 1967. Right.
I do write to him, actually. You're right. I really should.
So I think, Ivan, do you have a question right now?
I'll wait till later. We'll open it up to the rest of audience. If anyone has a question, please put it in the chat, or you can turn your cameras on now, and you can ask, raise your hand.
Raise your hand.
Raise your question that way, please.
And I should also say, Neni, we should maybe plug book culture, right? That if anyone is interested in getting the book, book culture is where they should go, the indie source.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes, I'm so sorry. Usually we have a table outside with the books. And I forgot that we are not at a place where we can actually have books to sell yet. So yes, please. Book Culture has the book, and they are one of our co-sponsors, I think. Okay, so here, Catherine Moore, if you would like to turn your video on so that we could see you, that would be great.
I can't. I just had operation. I just had an operation, so I'm not well.
Okay, all right.
Okay. So my question is, having been born and raised in New York City, and having lived through 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, it comes as a surprise to me that it took you so long to realize that this is a governmental, intentional way of making people live. It very much reminds me of deinstitutionalization, where people who were written off for many reasons, but wound up in state institutions to separate them from society in the 30s and back, were brought into the community and not given the means to survive. And they all fell into the shelter system, with especially minorities coming out of these detention and prisons. And it became a way of life. There's no way out. It's just a loop. So it's like the minorities weren't the only ones. Under Giuliani, elderly people were thrown out of their rent-controlled apartments, and they fell into the shelter system, and they're still there. And then some of them fell into the criminal system because they stole something, exactly what you were explaining, particularly if they were minorities. And they basically die in these places. And the whole issue was housing and, getting the real estate. It was during the Trump years, etc. So I was just surprised. I found your talk excellent. I intend to read your book, but that you didn't connect it with others you came across that had been thrown into similar sort of ways to survive. They're not really living situations, but there's no way out,
Thank you, Catherine.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was very insightful. Thank you. If you want to respond, Mr. Ravi, please.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's a book by I think Jackie Wang called Carceral Capitalism, where she kind of talks about how some of these institutions that you're talking about were kind of mortgaging through the use of debt. They're actually helping support the disenfranchisement of all of these different people. And you're right. I mean, I think I knew theoretically, and I had made these kinds of connections, but it really was very different to experience it firsthand and on that visceral level. And I think you're right. I mean, some of the men I met have been in mental facilities. They've been in prison. Some of them actually looked forward to being reincarcerated, particularly during the winter months, because it gave them a warm place to stay and 3 consistent meals. And there were ways in which they had kind of come to depend upon some of that. And yet, the thing is, I mean, I always think, I mean, statistically, if you look at marginalized communities around the world and what they earn, the per capita income, and yet a lot of times they're the ones who are being castigated as being the welfare queens, or the ones who are sucking out of the system, when in fact the system is the one that is putting them in that very position in order to kind of reinforce those who are in positions of power. And so I definitely hear you. I thank you for that point, Catherine.
You're welcome.
You can raise your physical or your virtual hands for questions, and if you don't have any, then Ivan and I will just go on talking. Ivan,
I have a question. So you admitted that you're an abolitionist, right? There's a quote in the book though, where you say, let me read from the book, right? That makes sense now. Oh, there's a question that you asked actually. How does good design interface with rehabilitation? So implicit in that is saying that the prisons should be better built. We should have better prisons, better conditions inside of prisons. So how do you reconcile those two positions? Abolitionists on the one end say we shouldn't have any prisons, and that statement is saying that we should have better prisons. How do you sort of reconcile those two different positions?
Oh, right. Yeah. I mean, I think what I was asking there is, when I was looking around me, so much of the architecture, the rhythm of the day, all of these things seemed to me really pretty toxic, and were not serving the incarcerated population in any way. And so I was just thinking about, if we were to, because I think being an abolitionist is a pretty out there view. Maybe it's becoming a little bit more mainstream, but most people can't see themselves going that far. And so I was just thinking about, like, and maybe better design, like, means instead of prisons, right? You could, I think, in terms of being an abolitionist, instead of prisons, if you had the treatment centers, if you had community organizations, if you had writing workshops. I'm a big believer in bibliotherapy, that being able to tell your own story and being able to get the tools and the language that allow you to tell your own story is the most important thing to help you heal. And so if those kinds of design elements were integrated into a prison, and it would make it a very different facility. I think all prisons should be turned into artist colonies, if you want to know the truth. No, but I mean, I'm being kind of facetious there, but I'm being serious in that same kind of like space to reflect and to grow and to be allowed to kind of atone for the things that you might have done wrong, to be able to have the tools to process some of these things and the support network to allow you to go forward in society. I think it wouldn't be a prison at all, but it'd be a kind of a place that could actually help a lot of people. And so if something like that existed, maybe I would be in support. But like as it stands right now, I think that prisons really aren't working.
That was an amazing answer, by the way. You get the fingers better for that one.
Ravi, could we ask you to read something from the book?
Yeah, sure. Well, I was going to read from that initial stop and frisk, but you know what? I think just the way the conversation is going, I'll read, and I will just mention in this book, Correctional, one of the kind of architectural strategies that I've used is I have in India, where my family comes from, there are 6 seasons instead of 4. There's also the monsoon season, the season of heavy rain, and the pre-vernal season that comes before springtime. And so in the book, I write these 6 letters, each name for one of the 6 seasons in India, in part because when I was thinking about the idea of assimilating, it kind of felt like hammering down 6 seasons into 4, having to like squeeze out certain parts of my personality and like leave it aside in order to fit this like assimilated American ideal. In retrospect, it kind of felt that way. And then, I think these letters are also my attempts at redressing any wrongs or speaking back to people I might have injured or people who are important to me. So I have a letter to my parents and to my daughters and to my ex-wife and to my partner, to my brothers. And I'll read the very last letter here, which is my kind of letter to the world. It is the pre-vernal season, which in Tamil is Pinpani. Pinpani is that pre-vernal season. And it has a little epigraph from Emily Dickinson, as I've mentioned. You know, I'm a poet, I teach poetry, and the letter from this little quote from Emily is, "This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me. Dear creation, I jacked up my life because I once saw God. Up on a mountaintop with one of my best friends as witness, I felt the ripple of the energy that keeps us connected, harmonizing with my own intent and possible futures. There were deer involved in a thunderstorm, but it's a revelation that will only feel mundane, even in the deployment of the most refined language. It's simply enough that it happened. I was provided that afternoon a destiny to which I failed to measure up, given a family I could have kept intact, if not for my own personal menagerie of pig, cock, and snake. That's what I find hardest to forgive myself for, because I'll never know what was down that other diverging road. Instead, I took the one less traveled by, the more painful, self-revealing path, and that has made all the difference. Robert Frost continues to be my American freshman college students' favorite poet, which always astonishes me because they don't seem to exhibit much in common with his bleak, overdetermined stoicism. I'm always glad to introduce the students to other poets, from running the gamut from Etheridge Knight and Claudia Rankin to Emily Dickinson and John Keats, whose advice to tell all the truth but tell it slant, or whose concept of negative capability being in uncertainty, mystery, doubt, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason, remains so germane. The world is never quite as monochromatic as we might hope, and the divisions between us are just in our minds. None of us are born wanting to marginalize another human being, yet when in history an entire economy is fabricated upon the enslavement of others, and some people continue to benefit disproportionately from that fact, we need to point it out, even if it makes us uncomfortable. When we see the outdated Puritan mechanism of shaming being used, we need to respond to it with compassion. For Buddhists, shame, if understood properly for what it is, an impoverished mentality, the terror of being judged, a state of lacking, the condition of perpetual insufficiency, can actually become a transformative principle. It can provide a gateway to a larger, more inclusive sense of belonging and help open us up compassionately to one another. It shows us how empty the egoism with which we invest ourselves really in compared to the vastness of our luminous true selves. In Madras, South India, where my father's family comes from, there's a sing-song taunt that you will hear in the dusty schoolyards. Shame, shame, puppy shame, all the monkeys know your name. The chant means to jeer that you've been found out, been exposed, bare ass as a newly born cur. The fact that one of the slang connotations the word puppy in Tamil has is penis only adds delectably to the cutting double entendre. This is the kind of phrase my bow-tied adversaries would intone in unison at my convent school when one of the younger students had peed himself in fright after being set upon by bullies wielding tiffin carriers. That nursery rhyme chorus is a way of othering, of making a distinction between the group and the individual, of drawing a line in the sand, saying, you're there, and I'm over here with the others. You live on the other side of the border from us. Isn't that what it means when a group or individual is cast beyond the pale? The linguistic phrase for impropriety absorbs connotations as it moves through time. Etymologically, the idiom refers to an archaic definition of that word pale, which is a region lying within an imposed boundary, like a staked fence, as part of Ireland was for 14th century English administrators. So that going beyond it was doing something outside those lines. It began to mean acting bizarrely or slightly abhorrently, literally leaving civilization behind. And yet, when we hear that phrase, now we can't help but see color. Pale face, as if possessing a white complexion, as in conforming and being civilized. Overlay that sense with the act of colonizing a territory or policing the grounds of propriety, and we have a very different signification indeed. Today, it is the prison population who are beyond the pale. Personally, though, I've always been more interested in the shadow, that part of ourselves that we are ashamed of and that we feel guilty about, the part that has the propensity to grow if ignored. The shadow is dangerous, primitive, irrational, reeks of the public lavatory, the taboo. If collectively we don't pay it the attention it deserves, it could swallow up an entire epoch. This is the place where shame might be productively used. Carl Jung has written that shame is a soul-eating emotion, and it is that, for sure, but in its corrosive capacity, it can completely hollow us out so that in the empty space cleared out, we have greater capacity for empathy towards those around us. Connecting with the part of ourselves we hope others don't see is to begin to dissolve the very mindset that harbors that hope in the first place. In the process of learning to forgive ourselves, we can begin to forgive each other. Here I stand, your Keatsian example of negative capability. I've been a professor and a prisoner, a thief and a saint, a citizen and an anarchist, mentally gifted and mentally ill. Consciously and inadvertently, I've inflicted harm on other living creatures, and I've sacrificed myself completely for their well-being many times over. I've been your mother, and you've been my daughter for so many lifetimes, all of us spinning together on this marvelous planet, orbiting a star in an unfathomable universe of stars. Let's actively, not abstractly, love each other and work to change this world we share to be more magnanimous. For in such daily acts of connectedness, grace resounds more permanently than the sound of a judge's gavel against a wooden bench. It's a reverberation to ripple us awake.
Thank you, Ravi. This was magnificently written, magnificently read. I wanted to ask you, how long did it take you to prepare and write the book? I mean, it usually takes me about 10 years to write a book, but you know, when we do the research and just sit down and change every single word over. But what was the process like? So how long did it take? But what was the process like in, you know, starting it from what I understand when you were at Hartford Correctional, right? Couldn't have started before.
Yeah, it definitely. I mean, I think it probably took about 7 years all told. But like you said, Neni, when I found out I had to do this time, I knew that I would have, as a writer, that this would be part of my survival mechanism, and that it would allow me to be able to cope, to almost kind of imagine myself as an immersion journalist parachuted down into this space. And so one of the first things that I bought when the money hit my books was composition books. You know, as many composition books as I could find. And I just spent time. I didn't want to forget anything. And so I would just write overheard conversations, and I would write down the content of some of the prison forms, the bureaucratic forms, write down some of the really disgusting foods that we were served, or the sight of the mold that was seemed to be growing every single day coming out of this vent, which has got to be terrible for the health of the man. You know, I would read books and I would copy down passages from the books. I mean, just kind of anything to have some kind of record. And, and this is where maybe I was I was a little bit of an anthropologist because of being an ethnographer of prison life and trying to describe, I described in the book how, the unit of currency in there is the ramen noodle packet, the soup packet, because they cost 33 cents basically. So 3 soups is $1. And so everything was in the currency of soups. It'd be going on a honey bun, 4 soups, people going up and down the tier, selling this. And all of this stuff I wanted to write down. But then what I didn't realize is like, those are just the notes. I kind of thought, oh, okay, I've got fill these notebooks. I've got my book right here. And of course, that is not the case at all. And when I got out and started transcribing these, I started to initially kind of see some of the threads of the story. But those early drafts, I think I was still a little bit embittered. We didn't really talk about this strand of the story, but there is this other way, a critique of mass media, because my situation, because I was promoted while I was doing this time, became a hot button issue in Connecticut. And I was all over the newspapers and I was on TV. And it felt to me like I needed to reclaim my own story from all of these different sources. But initially, when I was writing it, I was still pretty pissed off. I lost a lot of friends, it's just, when you go through something traumatic, it's a kind of a litmus test on where loyalty lays. And some people who I'd known for years backed away in a big way. And then other people who I just met stepped up. And you can never really kind of tell. And, it is good in some ways to kind of have a clear sense of who's important to you, I guess. But I still had all of these feelings. And I think I was not really kind of able to process my own culpability, take responsibility for the things that I'd done wrong. And then the overarching story, I'm a poet. Most of poems, they're a page or two. Writing a book-length memoir was a different beast altogether, because from the larger contrivances of plot and dialogue and character development, and how am I going to tell this story? And so it went through a couple of different drafts. I was lucky enough to have time, I mentioned artist colonies before, but I was lucky enough to have a little bit of time at the McDowell colony and these places where I had a month where I would just reshape the book. And then I have to say, the feedback that I got from a lot of different people, I have an agent for this book who gave me some feedback, and dear trusted friends, my partner who read it kind of had the idea for the letters, and I had the faculty at the University of Sydney who read drafts and provided feedback. And the other thing is, it didn't end up going with a big commercial press, for better or worse, but going with an academic publisher like University of Wisconsin, they had to send the book out, what's called double-blind peer review. So, the book has to go out, and then you get comments back, a letter back. And one of my readers in particular was really helpful and noticed little things that I hadn't picked out and things that I should have been aware of. And so I had to kind of integrate that as well. And, when I started this book and then when I ended it, we were in a totally different time. And that's why, in my case, I did actually write the epilogue at the very end, because it was like, okay, I have to write about George Floyd in some way. I have to write about what's happening with Black Lives Matter. And I have to address and acknowledge some of what has taken place from the moment when I started this book. So I really do have to say that it was in some ways a really collaborative process, because I got such great feedback from so many people, and finally kind of took the shape that I was happy to have it in. But man, it took a long time. And there were times I put the book away for like a year and a half, almost 2 years, because I was like, I don't think I can do it. I don't know if I want to do it. I don't know if my mom is still here. She did not encourage me to do it, because the Asian way to deal with something trauma is to bury a deep hole. You push it down and you put the dirt on, and you never discuss it ever again. And here I am, bringing it all up onto the surface after I've already gone through it. And it was excruciating because writing a memoir, you're writing about people who might not want to be written about. You're exposing certain painful truths about yourself. And so every revision, it was like I was unpeeling a little bit more and a little bit more until I could get that whole story out. But yeah, it definitely was a process.
Well, you talk about your ex-wife and Harka, right? And it's obvious that there must have been some tension there, but were there people who actually said, absolutely not, you will not mention me in your book, you will just not say a word about me in your book?
That's the thing. People are pissed off if you write about them, and they're pissed off if you don't write about them.
Oh, tell me about it. No, I know that.
It is kind of the way it works. No, I mean, my ex in particular really did not want, and she's the mother of my daughters, and didn't want to be in the story. And yet I couldn't tell the story without that strand. And so in the book, and I mention why, but I changed her name to kind of preserve her anonymity and probably minimize her role in certain ways. I know that when I shared the book with my family, there were things that, my sisters or my parents disagreed with my recollection. And this idea of like, what would the relatives think still holds a lot of sway. And then my mother actually was really helpful in helping me get the facts of my grandfather's life correct, and the names of cities and the dates. Yeah, I mean, I think some of my, and this is stuff that I cut out, but I had more about some of my colleagues at the State University that I was teaching at, some of whom were supportive and some of whom really were not in a big way. And but then, I felt like a memoir is not about settling scores and getting revenge. And initially, I think I had some of that stuff happening in it. And as I revised the book, I realized, the story is something very different than that. And that's what I have to have my allegiance to.
Yeah, no, the book is about, I mean, the objective is to present you as the author, but also as a subject of history, right? So you have to place yourself within history, and both the microhistory of the family, and also the wider history of the times, and that's what you do. I did not think that. I thought that the way that you present your ex-wife, I thought was completely, totally level, in the sense that we don't get. You keep saying that you love her, but we don't get a sense of whether this person has done something wrong or not. If you have done something wrong towards the, no, you do say that you've done something wrong towards this person, but you do a lot. But it's not that, as you say, it's not that you're settling a score with her. I thought that the way in which your relationship to your father is being presented is more complex. I think that you show the complexity of your father really well and deeply, right? A person who is organized, whose presence, whose being is organized constantly by being Indian, by being from Madras, by having lived in his uncle's basement, by being an engineer, by having gone to Howard University, and the pulls and the pushes between not just any father and son, but between a father and son who are on the two ends, the two edges of migration, of diaspora, of India, right?
And I just realized I can share the screen, so I'll just let you. This is my parents' wedding picture. And I'll show you my, these are my mother's mother and father. And so I kind of talk about their wedding day. And here's my grandfather as a journalist. This is Jawaharlal Nehru, the Prime Minister of India at the time. So I have some of these pictures in the book, but I always look at, I mean, how unbelievably young my mother and father both look on their wedding day. But yes, you're right. It was a complicated relationship for sure.
But also between you and him. I mean, we don't get so much about your parents' relationship between them. Which is very discreet, and and probably that's how it should be. But between you and him, my first book was written on my family, so I know what it means to give your manuscript to your father, your mother, to read, your uncle, and you're sitting at the dinner table and they're all coming at you from different angles saying, no, who told you this? And no, that did not happen. That did not happen that way. That, right? And it's always a process of remaking their own history themselves, as it is of remaking the history of you with them, right? I mean, it's not that people lie. It's simply that the experience of the particular historical moment, it's always dependent upon the historical moment of the now, right? I mean, we see the past from now, from the now. We cannot see the past from the past. Right, so it's not that we lie. It's not that people say no, this didn't happen because they want to lie to you. It is because all we have are the memories of the past. It's not, there's no possibility of being at two places at the same time, right? So I understand that both implicitly and explicitly. But what I was trying to get out of you was if there were, if you actually encountered actual objections from people to being included in the book.
I think I was warned by my attorney, because while all of this was happening, I wrote an op-ed about my conditions. I think it was published in the Hartford Courant, the 8 things I learned in jail. And my attorney was really upset because I still had some hanging stuff. And he was like, this is just going to piss off the judges and the prosecutors, and you are better served not. And there's this prohibition against speaking almost every step of the way. I mean, that's what it would be so frustrating. I mean, if you're in front of the judge, you're not meant to speak. People speak on your behalf. You're not really given a voice. Besides him and my mother questioning whether I should do this, my ex-wife saying that she really did not want to be in it. No one really, many of the men that I met were like, yeah, you better, if you write some, I better be in there. I don't want to see that written about Dorm B and you didn't put me in it. I was just going to say I did because, I had to, in the end, I'm part of the revision process, is cutting and excising. And there were some really pretty amazing characters that I met who I kind of had to leave out just because of spatial considerations. But no, I didn't have anyone really prohibit me in that way, which was good. I mean, I also didn't show it to most people until I was really far along, because I knew early on, hearing from people could really stop that creative process from happening. So it was almost like, oh, this is happening, so now I'm going to share it with you. And if you have anything to say, interestingly, my mother had a lot of kind of changes. My father did not really say very much, and he's not a huge reader to begin with, but I mean, in many ways, you're right. He still is a mystery to me because he's this stern, orthodox man and on one side, and yet when he came over to America, he took the name Sam Shankar, and he was a moonlighted as an amateur magician, Sam the Super, and would do bar mitzvahs and things. I was his assistant, and as soon as he would step out, he was back to being K. Shankar, like the strict, and it was like, whoa. And there was a way in which he was also adjusting his identity, I think, in a way, shape-shifting kind of way.
Yeah. But so you go through a lot, right? And we were talking about this. You go through a lot in this book. I mean, things happen a lot, as if they are, toads falling from the sky, right? I mean, it's as if the 7 plagues are coming down on you, and you go through the book showing that I don't want to say wrong choices, but taking the wrong steps, right? As if you don't know that if you say this to the policeman is going to, the cop is going to respond this way, right? I mean, it's like what Catherine Moore was, I think, on a certain level was saying earlier. I mean, have you seen films? I mean, did you know that if you actually talk to a cop that way, the cop is just going to take you in? So what if there's an innocence? There's an innocence in this book that just transcends it, right? I mean, from page 1 to page 231, there is an innocence in your relationship to the world, to the system, to the cops, to your wife, to your parents. There's an innocence there, which is not. I mean, initially I thought, no, this is naivete, and then I realized, no, it's not naivete. It's an innocence. It is a real expression of trust in humanity, in human beings. I think that comes through. So just walk us a little bit between that innocence and your response to the cops. I mean, it's.
I'm glad that you said innocence and not like a stupidity or I mean. There is a way.
Ivan did.
I have friends who were writing it that could say when they were reading it, they're like, "Oh, Ravi, no, don't do that."
No.
What are you thinking?
What are you doing?
When all of this was happening, I mean, there is. I think I mentioned in Sanskrit this face of a drishti, this cloud, a dark cloud that overtakes you, and it almost felt like there were things happening outside of my control. And yes, I was also like, just definitely like making the wrong step. Like I know and I say in the book, I've watched these shows, you never just talk to a cop without consulting an attorney. And I kind of know all of these things. And yet I was just kind of, I think the truth is when you are in a certain moments that you panic. That you do things and you act in ways that and if you're not thinking clearly, you definitely would not. So it did feel like it was like a combination of like bad luck, bad decisions, and it was just this kind of like thing of dominoes. And it came to a certain point, I was like, okay, well, what else is next? I just need to like hit bottom because I'm keep falling. And as what that phrase says, a wise man hits bottom, but a fool falls right on through. And it felt for a while that I was in free fall there, plummeting. And I think that it was really, part of it was the act of gaining control of my story and starting to work on this book. And then I felt, I think part of the reason I took this fellowship at the University of Sydney was it seemed as far away from all of what I was going through as I could get. And of course, I kind of talk about, but so some of this stuff kind of follows me there as well. But it allowed me to gain perspective. And all of a sudden, when I was looking back at Connecticut, it seems so provincial in some ways. And what seemed so devastating, I was able to put in perspective, kind of looking back on it. And I thought a little bit about, what does it mean to be in a country like Australia that was founded by convicts, right? What does that mean to the, and not that they don't have their own problems with racial disparity and policing and overrepresentation of the indigenous in their prisons, and a kind of a racism that exists in Australian society as well. But it felt very different to me. And maybe where some of that innocence comes from, because I found there was a refreshing innocence in Australia. And I love how when you go to a public event, for example, they're always begun with welcome to nation and an evocation of the original stewards of the land. And I know, I mean, a lot of my Australian friends believe that is simply lip service and it does nothing to change. But as an American, I was always deeply moved. And I just felt that having that in the air and in people's awareness can't help but shift things on some subconscious level. And what would it be like if before we had an event, we acknowledged the slaves on whose backs the wealth of the nation was built. And, here where I am, where the Narragansett indigenous people lived at one point, and who were driven out of their land. And I feel like we haven't really, part of why we have these scars that exist in the country is we haven't really taken hold of our history and taken responsibility for our history. And that's a way, as long as that happens, this kind of a scar will fester. But I think that if you can kind of acknowledge and take hold, and that's what I kind of meant in that epilogue, that conditions are different based on who we are and where we came from, and we might not be racist now, but it doesn't mean that we're not benefiting from institutions that were deeply racist for many centuries, and that still are propagating this difference between the classes and between the races, right? And that by our inaction, in a lot of ways, we're complicit in that system. We're helping that system continue to operate.
We're not racist, no?
Well, no, yeah. I was saying that theoretically.
Just double checking.
I'm not saying that.
Okay, all right.
That's the fantasy book.
Okay.
That's the next one, the sci-fi.
The sci-fi.
Sci-fi. Right, exactly. Okay, so you have certainly worked for your keep, as they say. But I want to mention the fact that in the summer, you will probably be teaching at the New York Writers Workshop in Greece.
Yes, thank you for I do teach with the New York Writers Workshop, which is a great organization that started to run writing workshops in the outer boroughs of New York and in public schools and other places, and has been doing a lot of immersive writing retreats. And so right before the pandemic, we had this event in Sardinia, and that was really the last time that I have kind of traveled. Hopefully the world is beginning to open back up, and so there is immersive writing workshop. You can find details at newyorkwritersworkshop.com, and we're going to spend 10 days with a couple of Greek poets in Athens. And so I hope that we're in a place where that's allowed to happen, but and with great faculty members too, Kim Adonicio and A.E. Stallings and some other really terrific writers.
That's great. That's great. We have the information on the chat. So if there are no questions and more questions,
I just got one last question. That's okay. One last question. If there was one message that you wanted folks who read this book to get out of this book, what's that one message you would want people to sort of pull out of this?
I think, well, there's a phrase that I use in this book that I say that we are all ineradicably interconnected. And I think if there is one message, it is that that we really are. I mean, the lowest among us and the highest among us. I mean, we are really deeply connected, and the welfare and well-being of one another matters to the welfare and well-being of ourselves, right? And there is a deep intrinsic way in which we're linked. And I think my experience, I talk a little bit about this Japanese idea of Wabi-Sabi, which in Japanese ceramics, if a totally symmetrical pot breaks, instead of throwing it out, you inlay it with gold and call attention to the flaw in some way. And so I believe that the scar can be a source of our beauty in some way. And so our own scars are the things that we make us unique, but that collectively, if we can actually acknowledge the ways in which we've wounded one another, that can then allow us to kind of move forward as a society and live up to our democratic ideals, which sadly, since the writing of the Constitution by men who were guaranteeing life and liberty and at the same time owned slaves and didn't want women to vote, maybe we can move closer to the ideals that document is supposed to guarantee all of us. And so that idea, interconnection, ineradicable interconnection, I think is what I want people to take away.
Just in case anyone thinks that Ravi Shankar is just too serious, I want to mention the fact that he knows the butthole surfers and the adventures of Buckaroo Banzai across the 8th dimension, which I thought I was the only person on earth who knew it. So two totally off the wall references that I read them and I thought, it's impossible. This cannot be. This guy, as Ravi said afterwards to me, this cannot be a reading universe that exists. So before I thank everyone, I want to thank your mother for being here. Mr. Shankar, thank you very much for being here.
Yes.
And I want to thank everyone for coming. Again, this is the inaugural event for the Justice Forum at the Heyman Center, the Society of Fellows, Heyman Center at Columbia University. You can get Ravi's book at Book Culture, our neighborhood independent bookstore. I want to thank Ivan for facilitating this. I want to thank Kay Zhang, who made it possible, and Lindsay Schramm, who also worked tirelessly to put this together. And Ravi, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you so much for speaking to us, answering our questions, sharing all this, sharing the books, sharing your thoughts, sharing everything.
Thank you.
Yes.
It's such a pleasure. I've really enjoyed being here. So thank you all so much.